I'm letting myself be quiet for a moment because it's ironic in a sense that most times when people study meditation, probably they themselves are least experienced, because in science, the observer should not be part of what is being observed in some ways. Possibly what I'll do tonight is share some findings about the studies of meditation on body and mind, and I'll end with some form of small practice as well. And I think I'll do both. In fact, the title is difficult for me because I have to ask myself, what is meditation? What is mind? What is body? And I raise that question not because I may answer it. It's because when I ask what is meditation, it becomes a complex phenomenon. What am I studying? And can I compare what I study to something else that's been studied? And let me just give you a broad range. I've been involved in a few studies observing meditators, and they range from people who claim after meditation they have voluntary pain control. So what they did in the laboratory is they unscrewed the light bulb and chewed the glass, and then they stuck bicycle spokes through their bodies. The way they did this very nicely was to sterilize this bicycle spoke by putting it on the floor in New York City at New York University, taking their dirty shoe, going over it like that, and then sticking it through their bodies. And then afterwards take it out. And then what we observed in those cases is that at least the wound closed very rapidly and there was no infection. Now, is that meditation? I mean, the person claimed to have meditated. Or is it when one studies therapeutic touch and the person is doing healing? Is that meditation? And what are the effects? I mean, it's really a very broad range. Is meditation the sitting quietly and then saying a mantra? Or is it chanting? Or is it sitting very quietly and just observing the breath? Or visualizing a Tibetan symbol? Or is it Sufi dancing? Which is? It's a difficult one, at least for me. So let me see how I would want to define for a moment where meditation would go. I think for my definitional part, I assume somehow that people meditate because somewhere in themselves they want to connect with a larger whole. However I would define a sense of unity. So it's a sense of achieving from a dualistic perspective, a dual world, to a kind of unity perspective and experience. And so if I took the meditational process to the extreme, then I would experience a kind of undefinable experience, mystical experience or whatever. And if I took a quote by Einstein, and I don't know if he really meditated or not, but I think he had an experience like this, he sort of said the following: the most beautiful and the most profound emotion we can experience is the sensation of the mystical. It is the source of all true science. He to whom this emotion is a stranger, who can no longer wrap in awe, is as good as dead. The deeply emotional conviction of a superior reasoning power, which is revealed in the incomprehensibility of the universe, forms my idea of God. That's Einstein. But it's probably that sense, and I'll go back a bit later about defining a few qualities of that sense at least. And so in one sense then, meditation may be a process or a mechanism by which I reach to a quality, an experience, maybe as Einstein in this case alluded to, or many other mystics. I may also want to make a definition in terms of purely practice of meditation. Is there a difference if I just meditate a half an hour a day, and then I can put it to the side because I did my good duty, and now I can be my normal self? Is the effect the same for people than for those who meditate maybe a half an hour a day, or maybe only 5 minutes, and somehow who hold in the back of their mind that quality, that sense of unity, that sense of wholeness? So in a way, every moment of the day would be almost like a meditation. I raise all these questions because they're difficult in study. How do you know what you're going to measure and observe? Let's see. And for science, it's even more difficult, because how do you measure the phenomena? Well, that's easy probably, right? You look at me, how do you measure meditation? Or, what should you measure? I mean, it's an interesting question. Assume now we can agree what meditation is. Let's say we're looking at a Raja Yoga technique where people practice sitting. They're saying a mantra or something like this. They repeat this many times. Now, what would you measure? What would you observe? The reason I pause is because it depends where I assume probably consciousness resides. If I'm a Western scientist, then I most likely would think I'm going to study the brain because I assume consciousness resides in the brain. And therefore I would use tools like the electroencephalograph, that's the electrical recordings of the head. And I would try to make an attempt to have an understanding. On the other hand, if I were a Hopi Indian who knows consciousness resides in the heart, I may want to study the EKG or the heartbeat and look at the subtle variations if this could reflect it. So in a certain way, what one observes depends very much on the framework one studies. And so even what I'll describe a few findings when people study meditation. Keep in mind, it doesn't mean that is what meditation is. I don't know what. All you can see is some effects, possibly. Let's see. The other part is, how do I know that even if both of you are now doing the same meditation, that you're having the same experience or a similar experience? Because in a sense, a meditative experience is an internal, individual in some sense, or universal, but at least from a subjective sense. How do I know that? How do I know that your experience is equal to someone else? Because there may be a difference in that question from if you study beginner meditators to those who are very advanced. As I raised earlier, the one who just starts sitting for a half an hour versus the one who does it the whole day, almost intuitively, you would expect there may be a difference. Let's see. And let me just go one more part about methodology, because I want to note that the meditational studies I'll report on will be the ones which are very limited to where people can sit quietly. Now that's interesting. I mean, so far I know there are almost no studies of Sufi dancing, which could be a meditative form. There are almost no studies of chanting. Because when you record, and people have tended to want to record the brainwave activity overall, you want to have people who can sit quietly and peacefully, because if they wiggle around and move their heads, which could be a meditation as well, the wires would produce by themselves, as they are wiggled, a little electrical signal, and you wouldn't get any recording. Can you see the dilemma or the problem? So the methodology itself will limit what you observe. And then the other part, I realized I made a note here to myself, how difficult it is to get people to observe. I remember in 1972, someone asked me to study a yogi, you could say, Gopi Krishna, in India, and the foundation sent us to do research. We carried our portable electronic equipment because we are very scientific. We want to see what is the meditation when someone has a Kundalini, quote, like experience. We passed through customs and all that stuff. We got to Srinagar. He was our host. He took exquisite care of us. And somehow he never wanted us to monitor him. In a way, who are we measuring? It's remarkably difficult to get outstanding gurus, meditators, mystics to come to a kind of funny laboratory place where they say, please sit on the chair, let's put the electrodes on your head and your body, and now get into Satori or Samadhi, and now do it right now. You see, there are difficulties because even if people claim they may get there, we may still not have the phenomena. It may be a little more fleeting. I mean, I can list a number of people we have attempted to study, and they vary. We studied with Gopi Krishna, which we never did measure. We talked a lot, so that's one way of measurement, you see, verbal output. In a nice way, you can listen to what is the subjective experiences, but it would be nice to get an independent, quote, physiological measure. Oh, we have even, tried to maybe potentially study firewalkers, and all of you now know that firewalking is easily done. You probably don't have to meditate, you can just do it. Any of you or others. But let's go on. If I start looking at people who are meditating, what is the usual phenomenon that tends to occur? And most likely the first phenomenon that may occur is relaxation. Because ask what happens as a person meditates. They tend to sit quietly. They're no longer running up and down the stairs. They may in fact relax. And in many meditational practices, the brain is trained, or the person is attempting to use their concentration in some subtle way to bring it back to a place or a point. And whether this is on the breath, whether it's on the mantra, whether it's observing the thought. It's a sense of attentional training. And in that process, often the person relaxes. And in fact, many meditative practices would say the first step of meditation is relaxation. Relaxation of body and mind. And overall, if you study electrophysiologically, people meditating, you'll tend to see some form of relaxation phenomena. Their breath tends to slow down a tiny bit in most cases, except if you start chanting. Their skin conductance, the sweatiness of their palm, tends to quiet and reduce. Often their heart rate may be more steady or regular, although there may be an increase in a phenomenon of sinus arrhythmia. That is not a pathology, it's a signal of health. That means that when you inhale, your heart rate goes up, and when you exhale, your heart rate goes down. That's perfectly healthy. What other things? And then I'll talk eventually about the EEG phenomena. Let's see. It's hard to say what really goes on when people meditate. I'm really struggling with the problem, because I don't quite know what is going on. So let me sort of cite some of the literature. I think that's the easiest way to do it. Let's first look at the physiology, I think, if I can find some. Okay. There are very early studies of meditators in the 1930s using electronic, i.e. looking at body phenomena of meditation. And as Teresa Brasi showed, there was an effect on the heart, and some yogis, that's a kind of style of meditation I suspect, could learn to control the heart rate. I mean, the items you have read about at times, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with that literature, right? Some people claim to control their heart rate, their blood pressure, autonomic functions. I would say it is true. I mean, true, I don't know what that means. It has been documented in science. If I think of it interestingly, you could ask, how do people learn that control? That's an interesting question, somewhere. Why should I want to, what is the advantage of being able to stop my heart or slow it down? Or how come that in meditation I could do this? For example, a recent, Swami Rama did this in Menninger, some of you know, right? What he did, he said in the lab, he told the experimenters, Elmer and Elise Green, that he could slow his heart rate down. He could stop his heart. And after they sort of got him hooked up, and he said the lab would not be responsible if he would die when he stopped his heart, and therefore essentially gave his permission. He did this study, he meditated, or got quiet, and he stopped his heart. He never really stopped at the event in the atrial flutter, which usually assumes that occurs, and then often people will die. The nice part in his case is, after about 10 seconds of atrial flutter, the heart just went right back as if it was normal. When the experimenter told him, look, stop, it's enough. Because the experimenters may have gotten nervous. There is control. I wonder what happens. It's an interesting question in meditation. How could I learn that control? I think, at least in the more yoga traditions, of a kind of Raja Yoga technique, which tends to mean very much a quieting of the self and a non-responsivity to the external world. That's one style of meditation, right? So if I'm in a quiet, safe environment, then I can do a kind of meditation where I get so quiet, in a way, I don't want to use the word contained, but in a sense, quiet and contained, that the world around me does not affect me. That is a type of meditational practice. It also may mean I can have a union in the world. For that phenomenon, there seems to be a lot of supportive data. There's an early studies in that sense by Anand and Shin and others in the 60s who in fact showed that this is the case. He took, you could say, advanced meditators, 6 of them, hooked them up in the laboratory, hooked them up, and now had them meditate. And what they then observed was that the brainwave activity, and I'll explain that for a sec, produced predominantly alpha activity. How many of you know what brainwave activity is or alpha is? If you put your hands up, I'll get a sense. Okay, about half of you. I'll define it in a moment more. He produced an alpha-like, the meditators produced an alpha-like activity during the whole meditation. And when they had the person put their hand in the meditation into ice water of about 4 degrees, and any of you have put your hand in ice water know it's not too pleasant, there was no change in the brainwave activity. Or, if a loud noise like that came, where some of you may have felt a startle, there was no startle reaction in their body. I mean, that was common for that type of meditation. So let me now define what people do for those kinds of studies. Brain waves. I need to really go back on that. You see, we believe consciousness resides in the brain, therefore science has developed many methodologies to record brain activity. One of the methodologies is to put electrodes on the scalp, and now you claim that if you record the electrical potential which the brain produces, you can now amplify this. The signal is very small, it's about 30 millionths or 40 millionths of a volt. So the height of the signal is small. Consider it's a flashlight battery is 1.5 volts. So this produces about 30 millionths of that. And it produces a pattern that wiggles or moves, has a frequency. And what people overall observe, as hopefully most of you are sitting here, and if you're sort of looking at me, and though some of us have learned to look, like my students at San Francisco State, and they meditate all the way, they just drift away. And they still look, and they have learned to be unknowing, to go, uh-huh. But at least if they sort of just look, and you're paying attention, whatever that means, the brainwave activity is very fast. They would say it's called a beta pattern. It's very slow amplitude and very quick. Or you could say it's activated. As you sit here now with your eyes, and now if you closed your eyes, you know how you can close your eyes and you sort of don't attend very much? Then, for a number of you, if you record over the back of the head, the brain waves would slow down and increase in amplitude, and that is called alpha. That's an alpha pattern. Okay? You could say, probably a better way to think about that pattern occurs, and even it occurs over the sensory motor cortex. That's the area where, let's say, my movements, if I tell my leg to move, would be located or felt. But even on those places, if there's a pattern like there on the sensory motor cortex, then I probably wouldn't be telling my leg to move. My leg is just really quiet. It really means that alpha-like pattern implies I am not reacting to stimuli. That's probably the best way to think about it. If I react, which hopefully some of you are doing as I talk, because you're listening or thinking or doing, then the brain would tend to shift to beta. If it shifts from beta to alpha, it means at least I am no longer reacting. Now let me go down the domain. You could say it's from alertness to less alertness or less reactivity. I can still be alert in a way in my brain. I could still observe, but I'm not reacting to. And that's probably close, at least visually, if I record from the back of the head. Now if I start slowing down, or I become more sleepy for most of us, you know what happens when you go home and you lie on your couch and after a while you get this kind of, ever had that feeling? They're kind of, or you close your eyes and you have the free movies occurring. Ever seen those? They just come from nowhere. It isn't quite like, it's almost like dreaming, but they just pop in. At that moment, the brain produces theta activity. And that's, like as if I'm still, it's like the pictures come in now. I'm not creating the images. I'm still aware of the images. But like I'm almost part there. And then finally, as consciousness resides more, or disappears more, then I would be going to sleep, and then the brain waves are very slow, and and that's known as delta. So that's the kind of pattern. I'm being, in some way it's too simplistic because it's a little more complex than that. But that's the thematic part. So now one of the first scientific observations then when you looked at, of meditation, saying consciousness resides in the brain, then in research you say, let's look at the brain. The way we can look at the brain, well, we could do anatomy. That doesn't, it's hard to tell of a dead body what happened, so that doesn't work. We could, well, how do you look in the brain anyway? That's an interesting question. I don't know. You see, so people end up doing the electroencephalograph. That's one way. And the other one they have used is radioactive xenon, in which you can look at blood flow through the brain. That's an interesting question. Where, what happens? So what people find then, now to summarize some of the data I started to allude to the work by Anand and Sinj, looking at yogis, is that their brain produced alpha activity, and that if you made loud stimuli or painful stimuli, there was no responsivity. That's an interesting observation. So that's a physiological effect. That is also the interesting effect of the people we have studied who have voluntary pain control. A few kind of unusual meditator types, such as Jack Swartz, when he sticks a sewing needle through his biceps. I don't know how many of you have seen that movie. Some of you? I should have shown that movie. It would have been fun. Next time I come, I'll bring a movie like that and you can see those kinds of voluntary pain control studies. Again, what's interesting when those people do that is that there is no reactivity, no response to the pain stimuli. That's an interesting observation. And when the person doesn't give a response, at least for them, the healing seems to be quite quick. I mean, the holes close right away and they have no infection, even though the needle, the sewing needle in terms of the sailing needle, those big heavy needles, were not sterilized, and they went right through the muscle tissue, or the ones we studied, there were bicycle spokes which went right through the side and through the cheeks. The tissue closes, there's no bleeding, and no infection. It seems as if if I learn to inhibit reacting, my body may allow itself to organize and heal sooner. It's a hypothesis. I want to say in addition that they if you took Jack Swartz and all of a sudden you put a needle through him, he would bleed and he would yell. So notice it's like he's setting a stage. He set a stage in which he prepared himself and literally asked a kind of permission, at a subtle sense, to allow it to occur. And then he doesn't react or interfere. As if he has learned that the I, or consciousness, is not his body. Does that mean? So and maybe a part of the meditative process then, at least as you could look at the yogic studies, is one understanding that the person who meditates, that consciousness, and that's maybe where one is going to, is not his body, his or her body. I ought to not be non-sexist. And here maybe you could see a certain sense of that ability to almost, I don't want to say dissociate, that sounds too harsh. Because I think they have the awareness of body, it's they don't react. And I think that skill in meditation could have applications to a number of health issues. Okay. But let me shift for a sec because it depends. You see, I'm not sure I know what to make of all this data. This one I can understand, the one I just described. You see, it's sort of useful, it's helpful. It's different if you study Zen meditators. No, it is. Because when you study Zen meditators, and people have now studied Zen meditators, a very old study by Kasamutsu and Harai, studied Zen meditators, and they studied both beginners, intermediate, and advanced meditators. So an advanced one may be somebody who's done it about 30 years, and whose Roshi said, I don't know what the Roshi said, but in a sense the Roshi sort of aligned them up and says, well, this person is in the beginning stage, this person in the middle stage, this person is more mature stage if there's such a state. And obviously that doesn't totally depend upon the number of years of practice. That's why an arbitrary allocation of time is not a good measure, but it's an approximation. When you study the Zen meditators, they do something different. They're not like the yogis, physiologically. What happens then, in the beginning phases of the meditation, their brain produces alpha activity, just like the yogis, and then it starts drifting like it gets even quieter. And consciousness withdraws to a certain sense even more. So they produce more theta activity, and the more advanced the meditator is, the more theta does their brain produce. And when you now give them a click stimuli, like this, that's what you do in the lab. You could say it's not quite like the painful stimuli. What you see for a moment is that the theta stops, the person orients, and then goes right back to theta. As if maybe that playful or that childlike mind, isn't that part of the certain Zen concept? Is almost demonstrated in the physiology. So possibly the physiological recording you may record may depend partially on the instructional set of the meditative practice. So if my practice is never to react, I'll learn to not react. If my practice is to develop an attitude by which I have almost an innocent look every time, then I would not, to the clicking of my finger, I would each time for a moment look in a kind of playful, childlike attitude and then come back. Without ever habituating. Habituating, what is that phenomenon? Normals, you see, the data is not as useful because you have to compare it to normals. What do normal subjects do? Normal subjects, if I go like this, the first time you go, right, you jump, and then I let it go, and after a while the noise goes, and you don't know it's there. Any of you have experienced if you live next to a railroad track. Ever had that experience? Those, if the train passes by the first couple of weeks you can't sleep, then after a while you sleep perfectly, and then there's one night the train is late and you wake up. What's wrong? That is called habituation, that phenomenon. And as if in the Zen-like physiology, as best as one can, is one understanding of it, they don't totally habituate. As if they keep having that innocence. That's interesting. Again, I don't know what to do with that one. It's an observation. I think the best way to look at the physiology is not to say from my perspective that the physiology is the meditative experience. It's just a phenomenon, the meditation may induce a body response. That may not mean that it's meditation, and I don't think the physiology is meditation. It's just a side effect of the meditative practice, which may be useful. Let's see, other kinds of studies. Well, it's fairly easy to summarize a number of them, and they include the work. And the largest group of subjects who have been studied have been the ones who have done transcendental meditation, a form of Raja Yoga technique. That's the biggest group. And they have been the work by Keith Wallace and Herb Benson initially. Or it's really Keith Wallace who did most of the work. In the early 70s, that work has continued for, till just recently when I was in Washington, D.C. at the Society for Behavioral Medicine, and they demonstrated eloquently that people who do TM, and I think that data is really correct, and if you constantly practice TM compared to a control group, and this is using insurance medical data, have fewer medical claims if they're matched for age and sex and non-smoking ability. Non-smoking and stuff. So there is some supportive data from the TM work that at least physiologically, if you meditate, your health status may improve. But before going too far, let me summarize overall what the most recent way of thinking is about how meditation may affect brainwave activity and the brain. Let's see, how would that data look? I think the model people have most recently looked at as a model is to say, meditation, what is meditation? Let's think about it for a sec. Let me list the end results of some meditative practices. Would that be okay? First, and then I'll frame the question differently. Earlier, what are some things after you've had a mystical or samadhi-like experience? What do people sometimes report after they had a very profound meditative practice? They may report a sense of undifferentiated unity. Some of you may feel that, have had experiences. Sometimes states of insight into the depths of truth, unplummeted by the intellect, Einstein's kind of statement, as I started with. A kind of transcendence of space and time. A sense of the sacredness, characterized by awe. And sometimes a sense of deeply felt positive emotions. Sometimes paradoxical experience, like feeling like you're reborn or you have died. A sense of, my words don't do it. I can't describe what happened. It's like trying to describe a four-dimensional world in a three-dimensional language. Or or Plato's cave model. How can describe a world which is only of shadows? When the sun goes through the opening, you see shadows passing by. And if I now leave that black and white screen, go outside and see a three-dimensional world, and now go back to the people who only see the shadows, how can I describe what's going on? There are no words, because that sense occurs time and time again. There's a sense also of the kind of transiency. All states are relative and move quickly. And possibly a positive changed attitude and behavior. It's interesting, if you listen to these terms, there is some supportive data that people are saying when people meditate, maybe what you're doing is you're shifting in your brain from a predominant left hemisphere, let's see, I was thinking of stage right and stage left, from predominant left hemisphere action for those who are right-handed, which is the kind of, the verbal, the linear, the analytical, the logical, the very, accurate type, to a kind of left to the right hemisphere, which people associate with kind of spatialness, the sense of melody, a sense of acceptance. That really maybe what all you're doing in meditation is you're sort of shutting up the left hemisphere so it won't talk, and allow the experience of the right hemisphere to become more predominant. I mean, that's a model because many of these words I just described, you see, are the kind of the non-discriminant words. And so they may be more like right hemisphere action. Is there any data for this? Well, before I answer that question, I realized that as I went through the research data, I never saw anybody do a study of left-handed people in this. Now, it's an interesting question, because in left-handed people, often these modes are not as bifurcated. There's so, if you're left-handed, and if you do get a stroke in medicine, if you get a stroke, you tend to recover usually a little bit better. Because your verbal ability is not as much limited to the left hemisphere. It tends to sometimes be distributed. Components to the right hemisphere, so a stroke may have less effect upon that. I mean, there's some other data. I'm not saying that's true for all left-handed, sinistral people. But it's an interesting question. I never thought of it till now. And so now I realize I should do a study to see if left-handed people meditate, do they have a quicker sense of reaching these qualities? Anyway, a side note. What is the data that may support that there may be a shift in the activity of the two hemispheres? And again, people have mainly looked at the brainwave activity. So they record not just from one location, they start looking at two sides of the head. And they now start saying what happens as people meditate. And overall what you first see, and that's interesting, is as a person starts meditating, there's usually a increased alpha activity on the left hemisphere and a little activation on the right hemisphere. Now what does that mean? Well, what does alpha activity again? Alpha activity, as I said earlier, occurs when you're no longer reacting to. So in a way, you could say you're putting this side of the brain in idle a bit and allowing the right hemisphere to take a tiny bit more control. It's also interesting that one of the other themes underlying most meditational practices is somehow concentration. Is that, or attention? Horrible word to use, I know. You must do this, right? But that sense of attention, is that familiar? Most of the, in Zen, right? Let's say you focus on the breath, and if you start daydreaming, which movie you're going to see tonight. You're supposed to come back to the breath. Is that familiar? Or is that common to almost, if I do a prayer, it would be very similar, right? It's the key to let the prayer just occur in a very subtle way, with my attention. It's interesting that attentional control in people may be slightly more located in the right hemisphere. And the way you can find this out is you can take, you look at patients who have had damage to their right hemisphere, the invert, and those patients who have right hemisphere damage tend to have a sense they have less ability to pay attention. They have a kind of neglect syndrome. They just neglect things a little bit more. So in a way, when you're seeing that the left hemisphere gets inhibited, the right hemisphere gets activated, maybe what you're seeing is the sense of the brain paying a subtle kind of attention. So that's the first stage. Then it seems if you repeat a phenomenon enough times, it moves in some sense from the cortical level, if that makes sense, to almost background. And then you would probably see an alpha activity increasing in both sides, if that makes sense. So there is both the sense of the beginning and the continuation of the meditative practice. So as I meditate more and it deepens, I've been using it for a long time, then you see less of that asymmetry. The most recent research would now suggest that, I hate to think, what would it suggest? It suggests really that both hemispheres are synchronous. That truly in an in-depth meditative experience, it may not be as much as the frequency, whether it's beta or theta, but it's possibly that both are equal and are almost cycling at the same rhythm at the same time. And it's interesting, as I said earlier, if you study blood flow through the brain, which people have done, you can see an increase in blood flow in the brain for both. So there is an enhanced amount of blood flow. And I wonder if you start paying attention, your body may quiet and more blood goes to the brain. It is remarkable when people, some types of meditation, people meditate, how much their metabolic level goes down. I don't know how many are familiar with that. When they study transcendental meditation, you can see people's metabolic rate go down. Metabolic rate usually means you need less oxygen per time period. That's the easiest way. Your body uses less. Although it may be paradoxical, your brain uses more and your body uses much less. The best demonstration of that has been a yogi in a box. Any of you ever seen a yogi in a box? What you do is take a yogi, put him in a glass box, seal him off. No, I'm serious. There's studies like this. Judith Green and Elmer Green report on a study like this. You put him in a box for 8 hours, and most of us after about 2 hours would get claustrophobic. And after about 4 hours we would think we were out of air, but this yogi will just go for 8 or 9 hours. And what is again interesting, when the yogi in the box just sits there in a meditative mode, if you want to call it that, his brain waves produce a continually synchronous alpha activity on both sides. As if you could say the attention is there, he's not falling asleep. That's interesting, because if you go to sleep, you would go toward delta. There's no sleeping during that time period. He stays there at that place where in a way he is not reacting to anything, and now all of a sudden the yogi can stay in the box for an infinite amount of time. I better not say infinite, for a very long time, at least 8 hours. Probably almost, and most of us would think all the oxygen would have been used up, or the carbon dioxide would have gotten so high we would have had a massive panic attack, because we would have been going, very rapidly, we would have been real nervous. It's interesting. So to summarize in a sense from all that data, probably the most recent thinking, it may not be that it's just the frequency alpha or beta, it's that both sides are probably synchronous or in tune. You don't have your left hemisphere not working, nor your right, probably both are somehow working and integrated. And maybe in a sense of wholeness. There's a whole other way, I would say, to measure meditation. And that is, you could look at the effect of meditation upon the subjective sense. What happens to the person? What do they start reporting? And I cited that a little bit earlier. Remember some of the feeling, the endpoints, or what happens when people meditate generally? And again, it's a hard question on the psychological sense. Let's think now not about the physiology. Let's look at what happens psychological, to the psychology. I think it's interesting. What is the most common theme that happens in meditation, in the practice of it? What do you tell yourself? Any of you? When you meditate, I presume most of you have meditated? Yeah.
Relaxed, peaceful.
One is relaxed, peaceful. Now once you go in meditation, go, I mean, you drift. And what do you often tell yourself about drifting? When you meditate? Stop and come back to whatever you're doing. Would that be right? Some meditations are pure drift. I could do, which is also true. But at least the more common ones people would do would be mantras, vipassana. How many of you know vipassana? Yes? No? Okay. Mantra is familiar, right, to most of you? Yes. Mantra and prayer, to me, I put in the same category. They're the same to me in style, because a prayer, I would also repeat, whether it's a Lord's Prayer, whether it's a Buddhist prayer, whether it's a Muslim prayer, it makes to me, it is a sequence of words which you know real well, which occupies your brain, which may, by intent of the words, connect one to a broader sense, and there's this belief that if one uses a sacred word or a sacred prayer, that it resonates in the universe, and that would facilitate within you. There's no hard scientific data for that. I'm not saying it is not correct. You hear the difference? It's very hard to prove that phenomenon. However, if you do that, and let me make a side note about that sense of resonance or something like that. There's only one study I know of, well, there are a couple in fact. Now let me think for a second. I think there may be some very small supportive data to the concept that if you meditate on a kind of sacred or thought, that it may tap into a kind of field that floats around us and that would help deepen it, and may even deepen us sooner than taking something that's totally new. Now, how do you do that? How can you test that? That's you know the phenomenon of the 100th monkey? How many? The 100th monkey is a kind of story where there's a little island and different islands where monkeys, eat their food, and there are different islands, and one monkey sort of learns to realize that if he washes, I think, his food or his banana, whatever he was eating, somebody can cook. Sweet potatoes. I knew someone else can tell the story much better. I know the story only slightly. So if I make an error, please just correct me, okay? He washes the sweet potatoes. I guess other monkeys imitated on that same island, and all of a sudden you have like 100 monkeys doing it, because this way they don't eat the dirt. So I guess it's easier to eat. And then almost like instantaneously, all the other monkeys on the other islands all do it together. They all now wash their food, as if you build up a critical mass which then spreads out. Okay, that's a kind of story. There's a similar study people try to do with human beings. It's an interesting question to ask. Could you prove that if people have repeated something many times, that it would be easier to learn or to experience? There have been now 2 studies done like that, and the way you do this is as follows. You take a series of Americans who are totally unfamiliar with Turkish, who don't know the language, or you take a Hebrew, and now what you do is you make a series of nonsense syllables up, which are Hebrew or Turkish nonsense syllables. If you know, nonsense syllable means a word that has no meaning, but you do it in the language, and you structure it so it looks just like any other word, and then you take a series of words which are in the language. And now you give these lists, mix them all together, and now you take it to this naive American who doesn't know Turkish or Hebrew or whatever, and now have him memorize the words. And the prediction would be, if there's a field phenomena, that the person would remember more easily the words which have been spoken many times, i.e. the real Turkish or Hebrew words. Does that make sense? Yeah. And in fact, that's what the studies show. It's not as easy to, you can probably tear the studies apart. That's somewhat suggestive. So I'm willing to even posit that maybe by invoking the sacred words, whether that's, whatever religion, but there's that intention, that maybe in a field phenomena, I both amplify that, and it may have a deeper effect than if I took something totally new. Another opposite study of that was done at SRI, Stanford Research Institute, where they started to do a TM study, Transcendental Meditation study, and they decided they want to do a control study. They didn't want to use any of these esoteric, Sanskrit words like Om or Aim or whatever the 16 mantras they use are. And instead, they used a nice word like one or something else. And what they found, at least, that there were the people who used the sort of English words had a few more negative reactions than the ones who used the Sanskrit words. Maybe that is related, or maybe, if I now wear my psychological hat, I'm more than willing to do that. I say it has nothing to do with fields. It is just because when you say one to yourself, you say one. Am I all by myself? You see, I can play both ways. But there may be a suggestion of language. But let's go back to that important part which I think underlies the psychological state of the meditation, of the practice, and that says, I sit quietly, and I'll do that in a moment. Then I focus my attention, and if my attention wanders to whatever, I bring it back. And I do this without judgment. And luckily all of us do that real easily, right? We just sit there, our brain goes, sort of goes away. We don't blame ourselves, we don't make any judgments in our heads, we just so nicely polite, just come back, attention. Right, is that easy? All of us do that. But in a sense, if I do that process, what I'm really doing to a large extent, if I went to psychology, is a global desensitization. What that means is, I am quiet, and even if all of a sudden now in this quietness, notice I'm reducing some of the editors of my brain, some material comes up, a worry comes up, a past traumatic event comes up, and I think most of us have some experiences like that. I don't say no to it. I don't say, like if an active editor say, don't think of that, shut it off. I repress it. What I really do say is, let it pass by, and I go back to the attention. Isn't that sort of what we do? And so in a way, what we are learning in our brain is to be more desensitized and not to be as attached to some of the phenomena. And if you look at meditators, if you now put them in a retreat, which people do obviously, like in Vipassana meditation is a strategy where you sit usually and you observe the classical way is you just observe your own thought patterns. It's the observer observing the noises of your brain, the thoughts, and just observe them without adding or subtracting to them. That's real hard. Ever notice how hard it is not to affect anything? Because it's like when if I observe the thought, I observe my brain thinking, and but then I say don't think, but now wait, it's real subtle. But if you study people like this, you see that as they deepen, they have a number of experiences. They get access to often some past traumatic events or psychological things, and those are known as discharges. And the discharge can be bodies twitching. Sometimes when people have aches or a past injury, when they meditate, that body part almost lets go as the image lets go. And so in a way there is some data that in fact as I meditate, I may be able to allow almost my past limitations, if I'm open in a very subtle sense, to come through without me shutting it off, without me amplifying and just passing by. So in that sense, I learn a slight detachment. Or unattachment, maybe that's a better word. And therefore, if I did that, I would be slightly more quiet. I would be less reactive in the world, ideally. Because if I think of my reactivity, it doesn't mean I don't want to have emotions to go out. I do. However, if I react to something, I don't want to react because really it reminded me of the time somebody didn't love me and I react to the past event in my brain. Is that familiar to many of you? Sometimes maybe you're slightly angry to our significant other or spouse, anywhere else but Berkeley. When it's angry, sometimes the event itself is really, is not worth how angry we got. Is that familiar to some of you? We have a resentment and all of a sudden we just blow up to this tiny thing. The person was just 5 minutes late and we have this massive. In a sense, what I want to be able to learn is still have emotion, but not to react with this massive past. And if I can let that past go, I would expect it to be slightly mellower. Or, not mellow sounds too soft. It just I can choose now to react, in a sense, versus being an automated machine. If I think of it in a slightly different way, then I would think as I do that, I would get a bit quieter. I would allow these emotional worries to pass through without getting the hook on it. And thereby, in some sense, I would expect my body to be slightly healthier. And let me think of that. Let's say you see, the reason I make that statement is that every time my brain thinks, you could think if you pull in a picture. Is that right when you think? Some of us think in pictures, others do it in sounds. I don't care how we do it. But when a picture or an image occurs in our brain, our bodies respond correspondingly. So if you think of your telephone bill, you realize your checkbook is minus $10, and you get this telephone bill for having called Toledo, and now it's a $142 telephone bill. You get ever had that sinking feeling in your gut for a moment or something like that? Is that familiar to any of you? It's that picture. And if I carry those pictures around a lot in my brain, every time that picture occurs, my body reacts as if I'm being threatened. And so one of the side effects, truly I think, of meditation is that if I practice and carry this attitude more during the day, I have fewer of those pictures involuntarily there, and I can choose to potentially stop that kind of pictures for a little while in the meditative practice. And if I did that, I would predict, in that sense, if that's the meditations I would do, that the health status of the person would improve. And now, is there any evidence for that? I cited already the study by Orm Johnson, who showed that TM meditators use less medical care. They are literally just as healthy. Their insurance bills are lower. Okay. There's also very nice studies using meditation, the taretas, for hypertension. So it's clear if one meditates, blood pressure can go down. However, I'm putting a however there. However, when I talk about that, it's not a meditation, which I do for 50 minutes every day, very nicely, and that's it. There's some data that even may be helpful. There's data at least from lying in the Shavasana. You know what a Shavasana is? Corpse position. It's asana. If you totally learn to lie in the corpse position, truly, that means I let every muscle in my body go totally flaccid. If I can do that, that means my brain is totally quiet. Because if my muscles are totally flaccid, it means my eyes are also totally relaxed. The throat is relaxed. If the throat is relaxed, I don't have the auditory pictures in my brain. And if my eyes are totally relaxed, I see the kind of gray-black world. I don't have any pictures. If I can be in that position voluntarily for about a half an hour a day, and I do this for a year, the blood pressure of some of the subjects have dropped from like 184 over 130, fairly high pressures, to normotensive level. That means less than 140 over 90. It's remarkable. However, most of us have a very hard time lying in a corpse position. It's one benefit. So what I'm saying in a sense, if you expect medical benefit from meditation, you could try the corpse position. I think it's very hard, challenging to do it and let go. Overall, it means that I need to carry the meditative attitude through my daily activity. And I think most of us also know that is quite a challenge. Would that be right? It's like it's perfectly okay to do it when I'm conditioned. Conditioned meaning, I have my picture on the wall, I have the incense, I do have a rosary bead, and those are useful cues to re-evoke the experience. The question is, how can I hold that in the back of my head when I leave the podium? when I leave the audience, when I go back in my car and now somebody cuts in front of me. And how can I hold that attitude? And that is the challenge. When I learn to do it even at those moments, and what I'll call, in medical terms, generalize the skill, notice it goes to other areas, then the health status really improves. And there's very good data that blood pressure goes down. If you're intrigued, there's a lovely number of scientific studies by Patel and North in London, published in Lancet, so it's even legitimate, who showed that doing meditation, breathing, and biofeedback together was a very useful strategy to optimize health. I want to make a separation for me. I don't think the purpose of meditation is just to get healthy, physically. I mean, that's how many of us use it. There's something more to that, as I started to say earlier. Let's see, do I want to make any other, well, if any questions on clarity or non-clarity of the scientific parts of meditation? I don't know if that's what you came for. Yes, no, yes?
You were talking about some subjects who were able to desensitize themselves to pain. And you were also saying that in meditation that they might drift into an alpha or a theta brainwave state. There's something more going on there, though. Could you talk about that? I mean, besides the alpha, if I go into an alpha state, if I get a biofeedback machine, I go into an alpha state, and if somebody puts a needle through my arm, I'm obviously going to feel it. So what besides this are they doing? Is it an autosuggestion?
No, I think it is the ability. I think that talk about training. It's the training to hold your attention on the purpose of the task gently. In that sense, I would say there's a similarity with some of the athletes. Some top athletes also can do that. It's like, any of you saw, what is it? I think the 76 Olympics with the Japanese gymnast who had broken his leg. And then, in order for the team to win, he had to still perform a ring maneuver in gymnastics, and he did this with a broken leg. And what is so lovely in it, he did it perfectly, the maneuver. And in a sense, you could say his brain was so much focused on the task that he was unaware of any of the aches and pains. I'm not saying he's shutting it off, but his attention, there's different saying I don't want to listen to that, but it's like he was just doing the performance perfectly, and then you could see him in the rings, and finally he did his dismount. And if you know in the rings you do a dismount, and you have to end perfectly on both legs, and that's fairly painful if you have a broken leg. You crumple. And he did it perfectly for a moment, then he just crumpled. But in a sense, you see that phenomenon a lot. So it's not unique only to meditation. But let me do it differently. The key, and that's at least when we have trained subjects, because you could have said, let's look at this physiological data. That's interesting, do people produce these alpha waves? Okay, let's do biofeedback, right? That's the use of electronic instrumentation to feedback what your body does. Let me put electrodes on your head, listen to your own alpha sound, or whatever, and now keep it on, therefore you'll get into samadhi. I mean, I don't think it's that simple, because the key is to learn to not even react to stimuli in a certain way. And it's clear for the people we have studied that those who learn, and they probably do it by kind of focus, it doesn't mean you have to say a mantra. I'm not saying it's the content but it's a certain way I hold my attention by which, if the pain stimuli occurs, it's just nice and interesting, and I don't reorient to it. And that is a remarkable attitude, and I think it is very healing. So if I took a side note now let me say, is there anything I can use for myself in healing from this? I think there will be two parts. One, I'll allude to this segment here in a moment, and the second, I'll go to the relaxation piece to end with. The first one, I think, is the way I relate to the injury or insult to my body. I think for many of us, what we do when we have chronic pain or an injury, we don't just relate only to the present. We have a whole sequence of past pictures that really exist. We already know it's going to hurt. How many of you have been to the dentist and you say ouch before it ever happened? Right? You can't go sit in the chair till you have the Novocaine. I mean, I wonder, I always want to do a study where I would give people Novocaine except it's saline, salt, and to see if they would react pretty well. And for a number of people, saline solution will work perfectly. Because we have a mental image, it now will be okay. When it's really okay, I truly relax, and the sensations are slightly different. It's very hard to learn that detachment. That's one of the advantages, in a sense, you learn in the desensitization part, in the meditation. You learn to keep coming back to the present. In some way. That's the first phase of the attentional training. There is, in a sense, no expectancy and no reactivity. And I think that makes the big difference. Most of us, if we are ill, have something different. We have an expectancy of the illness. We have a picture in our brain already, what it's supposed to do, and how it's supposed to heal. Is that sort of right? But let's look, let me take I mean, I could do a study. If I had a little baby here, it would be great. Any of your own, well, a little baby. But if I took an adult and I stepped on their toe, what would you do? You say, ouch. And what else do you say? Or you snubbed your toe, that's easy. You're walking barefoot in the house, your toe hits between your table, it gets caught and you really snap it. What do you say to yourself? Ouch. What else do you say? What? Yes, dummy. Or some of you may say less polite things. Isn't that sort of right? And then you try to say, I don't belong to that lake. It doesn't really belong to me, right? Especially, is that familiar? And the way I dissociate from that body part? I think health is do neither, is not to dissociate. It's somehow to stay present and not judge. Now let's take a little baby. Some of you owned a two-year-old kid or so, right? And the 2-year-old child, right, snubs its toe. What does the child do? Ah! Or whatever, right? In a different tone, obviously. And what does mommy do? Kiss it and make it better, right? And what happens to the pain? You know, I'm always impressed in babies or little kids that the pain goes away so quickly. I would recommend any of you snub your toe to get your spouse to give it a kiss. Nice. And you can wash your feet before or after. But note in a metaphorical sense, but if you look at the attitude, what happens for an instant, it's you acknowledge the event for the child, it hurts, and then what you do is you bring, in a gentle way, a caring and consciousness through it without judging. And the child can then let it go. And the adult, and it seems to heal more quickly. Like there's a different image of the expectancy. And I think that funny piece, what I just described, I found real useful because my students have reported when they take those kind of attitudinal pieces that their health status slightly improves. Like most of us get burned in the kitchen. I've sometimes ever had that experience. You take a hot pan and burn. Now, next time you have that opportunity, notice what I changed the wording, you see. Most of you say, you already pulled a picture, the blister and all that stuff. Your body is remarkably good in following instructions. But now if I accidentally have that opportunity, then, it doesn't mean I keep holding the metal. I can still put the pot down. And now instead of saying, oh, blank, 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 right? And sort of being angry at myself, now I could just use that meditative process and just observe the interesting sensations without judging, without tightening up. Because the first impulse is, I feel the pain and I go, Grah! And that's just what the yogis and even the Zen people didn't do. The yogis, as if their bodies didn't react at all, and the Zen just sort of looked at it interestingly, like a child. That's interesting, and then let it go. And so now I can observe it, and maybe I don't say that's good or bad, it's just interesting, and I keep bringing a sense of wholeness in there, or something, or kiss it, whatever. My students have reported time and time again, if they don't brace, they learn not to inhibit that tightening, that the blister doesn't form. It's just interesting to me. You see, I think and notice you have no mental image where it's supposed to go. What I thought I want to end with is that I think the meditative attitude is a lovely way to get centered and quiet. It will induce relaxation. It may make oneself less attached in a certain way. To negative images, it allows one to be quieter in a certain way, still with strong emotions. There's a difference between the two. And that quieting place is self-healing. And I think the data is supportive on that. And if I am in that place as a person, then from my belief at least, it will also affect my people around me. So in a sense, emotions are contagious. And in a much exaggerated version, I think those of you who know about therapeutic touch know that you can do a kind of meditational strategy where you adapt the principles of many meditational approaches, which means a sense of unity, a oneness, and then you allow that healing energy to channel through, and it seems patients feel better. And for those in whom the hemoglobin is low, the hemoglobin will come back up. So that's another way to measure, potentially, a kind of meditative attitude. But when I get quiet, it is healing. And it's interesting that a research collaborator, or a research friend of mine, Inge Corliss, just reported on a study she did at San Francisco with AIDS patients, AIDS patients, that when she did a kind of therapeutic touch and imagery with them, which they would also practice, that their moods and attitudes went up and improved. And at least it's supportive health status, it's critical in health status to have a positive frame of reference. If I take a frame of reference, I am bad, there's nothing I can do about it, it will last forever and affects the rest of my life, my immune system gets suppressed, I get, it's correlated with a lot of with psychological and physical illness. Meditation, interestingly, shifts one out of that framework, if you think about it. Because in the meditational framework, I will learn to say, not to judge, I am bad or anything, it just is. One learns that the world is both stable and unstable. I'm just there. And the positive attitude becomes global, not the negative event. And so there may be a health-promoting phenomena. In addition, as I meditate, I get quieter. And the quietness, I think, when I get very quiet, I don't pull in those negative images, my body has an intrinsic self-healing potential. And that is now allowed to be expressed. And I think that truly is the inferential positive effect of a continued meditational relaxation practice, that at some level, as I quiet down, and I may need to quiet for 20 or 30 minutes, very peacefully and quietly, that in that quieting, as if the body can reset its own thresholds. So maybe what I'll do is let me guide you through a momentary quieting and relaxation, if that's okay. There are many ways to quiet. And I could ask you to tighten your muscles and let go. I could say, forget about all your thoughts. That's like thinking, don't think of the pink elephant. What color was it again? Not pink, right? Notice they're very difficult. So sometimes to quiet, it's easy to go by the side way. Okay? What I will do is, for fun, I'll guide you through a kind of imagery, which is sometimes easier to do, where I think of something positive or easy. And then, at the end of the imagery, I'll ask you just to be quiet and do your own meditation or guided meditation for a little while, and then come back. And before doing anything, just observe how you feel. And notice when I said that, how all of a sudden you get a little more anxious. I'm supposed to figure out how I feel. Could you feel how your heartbeat may have quickened for a sec? Ever notice when you try to observe your own breath even, you're supposed to, if those who have done meditation of breath observation, the moment you observe, you figure out how should it go, up or down or in and out. How can I become the observer without affecting? And I think that's in a certain sense a core process of the meditation. And maybe in those places, I think the use of biofeedback or other techniques may be useful tools. They could be a kind of modified roshi who can hit you or something like that to remind you. Okay. But so you have wiggled right. I would loosen my belt for an instant. It's easier to meditate and relax if my tummy allows itself to bubble out, although I know it's not socially acceptable. But just do an experiment and just see if it is easier. Okay. And maybe if it feels comfortable, just let your eyes be closed. If you want to open them, it's perfectly okay. And at any time you feel you want to stop, it doesn't feel comfortable, just stop. And don't, and just gently, quietly wait till we're over. There's no real process. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to sort of image the scene along the beach. And I think most of you probably know beaches or whatever. And it's a place where it's very safe. So if you have past experience on safety at beaches, remember it is a very secure, safe place. Just imagine that you're walking along the beach. It's mid-July. It's very, very warm. And it's 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The sun has not yet begun to set, but it's getting low on the horizon. The sun is a golden, blazing yellow. The sky, a brilliant blue. The sand, a dazzling, glistening white in the sunlight. And as you're walking, feel the cold, wet, firm, hard-packed sand beneath your feet. Taste and smell the salt in the air. There's a residue of salt deposited on your lips from the ocean's spray. You can taste it if you lick your lips. Hear the beating of the waves, the rhythmic lapping to and fro, back and forth, of the water against the shore. Hear the far-off cry of a distant gull as you continue to walk. Suddenly, you come to a sand dune, a mound of pure white sand. And covering this mound are bright yellow buttercups, deep pink moss roses. You sit down on its crest and you look out to the sea. The sea is like a mirror of silver reflecting the sun rays, a mass of pure white light. And you're gazing intently into this light. And as you continue to stare in the sun's reflection of the water, you begin to see flecks of violet, darting spots of purple intermingled with the silver. Everywhere there is silver and violet. There's a violet line along the horizon, a violet halo around the flowers. Now the sun is beginning to set. With each movement, with each motion of the sun into the sea, you feel yourself relaxing deeper. The sky is turning crimson, scarlet, pink, amber, gold, orange as the sun sets. And as the sun sets, you're engulfed in a deep purple twilight, a velvety blue haze. You look up to this night sky. It's a brilliant, starry night. The beating of the waves, the smell and taste of the salt, the sea, the sky. And you feel yourself carried upward and outward into space, one with the universe. And let yourself just being carried out into space, that once with the universe. And now for letting this oneness just continue. Now just for a moment, meditate on the word love. And what I'd like you to do, as I'm in this quiet place set at one and in unity with the night sky, I ask myself, what is love? And I pause. Let a thought occur do not follow it, and then ask it again. And I continue to repeat, like a mantra, the question to myself, what is love? And as I repeat that question, I feel this quietness in me without really expecting. I just ask, what is love? I pause. Let any image, thought, feeling occur. Let it just be, and ask again, what is love? And now, some of you may want to deepen this or continue for a long time. You can do that at home or other places. But for now, just let that questioning just gently come to a pause or to an end for now. And then, I'd like you just for an instant, think of someone who loves you, and get for a moment, just think of them for a moment. And whether it's a grandparent or an other. And as if now what I can do in this quietness, having that sense of unity, I can, as if I inhale, I can almost imagine this feeling coming in. And as I exhale, I could almost think that that sense of love or caring, compassion, can go out. And as I sit here quietly, I can almost, on the inhalation, feel it streaming in, and as I exhale, let it stream out and through me. And I could think that slowly as it continues to occur, that kind of warm, caring feeling goes through me, and then gently it allows it to expand, as if like I'm a cocoon, and the cocoon expands more and more. And so initially I am in the cocoon, and yet as the continued streaming occurs, the cocoon includes the person next to me, the person next to them, the people in the room, and expands outward and outward. And then knowing that I can do this anytime, anywhere, and in fact, the more I practice a meditation technique, whatever is your style, the more it deepens, the more easy it will occur. I now just gently let myself become more aware again of the room, and knowing I can reach that quietness anytime I choose.